That's where we're at. We're July of 1966 in Chicago. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize a march through the very dangerous white neighborhoods of Chicago to protest the poor treatment of Negroes as concerning education, employment, and unfair housing practices. As I kind of alluded to yesterday, the marches are going to be very dangerous. Hundreds of angry whites are going to be throwing both bricks and bottles at the marchers. So as they're marching through these fairly affluent white suburbs, the people have lowered themselves to throw both bricks and bottles at the marchers. And Dr. King himself was hit in the head with a brick during this march and was later interviewed about his experience during the march. So King himself was hit in the head with a brick during this march through the white suburbs of Chicago and was later interviewed about his experiences. And this is what he said, and I don't necessarily want you to write this down, but I want you to picture what he's saying. He said, "I think it is one of the most tragic pictures of man's inhumanity to man that I've ever seen, and I've been in Mississippi and Alabama. But I can assure you that the hatred and the hostility are really deeper than what I have seen in Alabama and Mississippi." You know, that was kind of the worst of the worst, Alabama and Mississippi, as far as, racial problems. And he's saying that what he experienced in Chicago was worse than he had seen in the Deep South in Alabama and Mississippi. Now, historians will tell you that it was at this point in his life that Martin Luther King Jr. really began to realize that the civil rights movement may result in his death. Okay? At this point after Chicago, the way that went for him, he first started to believe, I could lose my life in the civil rights movement. Okay? So when he first really realized it to himself that the civil rights movement might result in his death. Well, even though his march might have seemed unsuccessful, and even though you had awful violence in Chicago during the march, it did spur negotiations between Dr. King and the city leadership of Chicago about the issues he was concerned about. So he met with city leaders of Chicago, and they made a verbal agreement that they would stop the marching in Chicago if the city would promise to work on improvements as far as housing, education, and employment in Chicago. So they kind of got together, did spur a meeting with city officials in which Dr. King said he would stop his marching in the white suburbs of Chicago, and city leadership promised that they would do their best to make improvements as far as housing, education, and employment opportunities in Chicago. Well, as I mentioned yesterday, during this time, many of the younger generation of Negroes believed that change was not going to occur under Martin Luther King's philosophy of non-violent protest. These young generation of Negroes were now looking for a little bit different philosophy of civil rights, one that would be more violent. And then in the middle of this, we talked about Malcolm X, who was one of the instigators of Black Power. He was assassinated. He was killed. And young Negroes interpreted the slain leader's death as a sacrifice for the Black Revolution. And Malcolm X became a martyr for this new Black Power movement that's going on. Now, ironically, do you think that Malcolm X was killed by white people? He actually was killed by black people that had a lot different philosophies in religion and the way this thing ought to go. But he became a martyr for the Black Power movement after his assassination. You know who he was very good friends with until he got so radical? This friend had to kind of separate himself from him. Very famous sports figure in the 1960s. Very familiar name, certainly would know it. Was a boxer. Muhammad Ali was very good friends with Malcolm X, and Malcolm X got so far right that Ali's supporters encouraged him to dump his friendship with him because it was going to cost him in the end. It was kind of interesting. Well, that'll take us to our fifth example of civil rights issues that President Johnson dealt with during his Great Society, and that was riots in Detroit, Michigan. Riots in Detroit, Michigan. Now this made the Watts riot look like a minor incident. And this happened in July of 1967. And in July of 1967, another major riot occurred in the United States. This time was in the city of Detroit, Michigan. And this started kind of the same way in a way as the Watts riot, kind of an innocent thing. On Sunday evening, July 23rd, 1967, on Sunday evening, July 23rd, 1967, the Detroit police raided an after-hours unlicensed bar in the center of Detroit's poorest black neighborhood. Okay, I'll repeat that. On Sunday evening, July 23rd, 1967, the Detroit police raided an after-hours unlicensed bar which was located in the center of Detroit's oldest and poorest black neighborhood. On Sunday evening, July 23rd, 1967, the Detroit police raided an after-hours unlicensed bar in the center of the city's oldest and poorest black neighborhood. Does anybody know what an after-hours unlicensed bar would be? It'd be illegal for what reason? Two reasons. You don't have a liquor license, so you're supplying alcohol at a bar without a license. And after hours means, when do most bars, when are they required to shut down? Well, you hopefully don't know that, but 2 a.m. Okay, that's normally when bars shut down, is 2 a.m. Well, this happened to be a bar in the middle of Detroit's oldest and poorest black neighborhood that didn't have a liquor license and was going after hours. Probably something that maybe the police could have been, I mean, seriously, I mean, who cares? Well, the thing that was even worse about it, the party that was going on that evening in that bar was, the people there were celebrating the return of 2 black servicemen who had come back from Vietnam. So they're having kind of a party to celebrate that 2 of their boys from the neighborhood, from the hood, so to speak, had returned back from Vietnam safely, and they were celebrating. Well, police arrested all 82 people that were attending the party. And when they arrested them, what's the procedure? What were they doing when they arrested them? You get arrested, what happens to you? You get put in the police car and get taken to police headquarters. Well, guess what happened as they were putting these 82 people in police cars, putting them under arrest? A crowd group, okay, a crowd group, who also were pretty distrustful of the police, similar to that what happened in Watts. And pretty soon an empty bottle gets thrown through the rear window of the police car. Somebody throws a wastebasket from the bar through a front of another store window next door. And the next thing you know, Jed's a millionaire, and by mid-morning, you've got looting and rioting and violence all across the city of Detroit. So by mid-morning the next day, this escalated into looting, window smashing, rioting all along that area of Detroit where that bar was located, and it became an unbelievable mess. Now, this is kind of an interesting story because there was a person that wanted to kind of keep this from getting way out of hand, and we talked about him, and that was Michigan Congressman John Conyers. And we talked about he was the one that initiated the Martin Luther King holiday through the legislation. We talked about that on Martin Luther King Day. Well, John Conyers came to the scene. He was a Michigan congressman. He came to the scene. He climbed atop a car in the middle of the street and addressed the crowd to try to get them, to get settled down, because he did not want this to turn into another Watts riot, frankly. Okay? So Michigan Congressman John Conyers climbs atop a car in the middle of the street, and he addresses the crowd to try to get the crowd settled down so there wouldn't be a major incident. Well, as he stood on the car and spoke to the crowd, now remember, he's a black politician, they pelted him with bricks and bottles. He was pelted with bricks and bottles. And people started fires across the city during these riots. And the wind came up. And you know what wind and fire does? It causes you a lot of problems. And it was very, very hot. It was in July. 25-mile-an-hour winds began to blow. And these fires just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And businesses and homes went up in flames. Firemen tried their best to extinguish the flames in the middle of a riot. So as they're trying to stop the things from burning down, they're being pelted with all kinds of different things. It just turned into an unbelievable mess. Well, it got so bad that at 5:30 p.m. that evening, the mayor of Detroit, Jerome Kavanaugh, requested that local police and the National Guard be brought in to try to restore order. So by 5:30 p.m. that night, it got so out of control that the mayor of Detroit, Jerome Kavanaugh, put in a request that local police and the National Guard be brought in to restore order. This is just kind of unbelievable. At 7 p.m., those firefighters simply abandoned that 100 square blocks that was on fire and gave way to the troops, National Guard troops that arrived in the city. So they never did get the fires under control. At 7 o'clock, they simply left and gave way to troops that arrived. At 7:45 p.m., Mayor Kavanaugh instituted a curfew from 9 p.m. until 5 a.m. the next morning. No one could be out on the streets according to his curfew from 9 o'clock that night until 5 o'clock the next morning. He did that at 7:45 p.m. Mayor Kavanaugh instituted a curfew from 9 until 5. 7 minutes later, a 16-year-old African-American boy became the first gunshot victim of the riot. 7 minutes after the curfew was instituted at 7:45, in other words at 7:52, a 16-year-old African-American boy becomes the first gunshot victim of the riot. And he gets even crazier. The next morning, which is Monday morning, the 24th of July, the governor of Michigan, George Romney, orders 800 state police officers and 8,000 additional National Guardsmen to the city to try to get this thing under control. It was getting nuts. So Monday morning, July 24th, Michigan Governor George Romney ordered 800 state police officers and 8,000 additional National Guardsmen to Detroit. I mean, can you imagine? You got a battle zone going on here. You got 1,000 police officers and 10,000 National Guardsmen in there. And that wasn't even the end of it. They later brought in 4,700 federal paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. President Johnson ordered them to the scene to help restore order. So now you've got nearly 5,000 federal paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division who were ordered to Detroit by President Johnson. Most had just returned from where? Vietnam. Most had just returned from Vietnam. And Johnson orders 4,700 paratroopers into Detroit. Well, when these paratroopers arrived, they came under fire at the outskirts of Detroit, and so they set up operations at a nearby school. Can you imagine Warland High School being taken over by 4,700 federal paratroopers trying to keep the town under control? They set up their main office at a nearby school. They set up their operations at a nearby school, and they installed floodlights at the school and put machine gun nests in all four corners of the building to try to protect themselves as they got this thing under control. So 4,700 federal paratroopers arrived. They come under fire at the outskirts of Detroit. As a result, they set up operations in a nearby school, and they immediately installed floodlights and machine gun nests in all four corners of the school building. The military also brought in Jeep patrols. Anybody know what Jeep patrols are? What would be Jeeps? And what would be in the back of the Jeep, like the box? M16 machine guns mounted and ready to go. So they even brought in Jeep patrols with M16 machine guns mounted, and they were cruising the city to try to get things under control. The Army also brought military tanks into Detroit. And you know what the paratroopers' main job was? To try to get the tanks back that the military had taken from them by citizens. You had citizens in Detroit rioting, driving American military tanks that they secured from the military. And the paratroopers had to recover the tanks from the rioters that they took from the National Guard. It was just crazy. And the violence finally ended on Thursday, July 27th. This went on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, full days, and finally ended on Thursday the 27th. And the National Guard left on August 1st. Here was the end result of the riot, damage-wise. 43 people were killed. 33 black people and 10 white people were killed in the Detroit riots. 43 people lost their lives, 33 black, 10 white. Approximately 1,200 people were injured and over 7,000 were arrested. 1,200 people were injured, over 7,000 people arrested. The total property damage was $32 million. Just property damage. That would be stores that were either looted or destroyed. $32 million. And 25%, kids, of the city of Detroit was burned. 25% of the city was burned. The losses in the Detroit riots exceeded, in 1967, $150 million. $150 million. That's a lot of money in 1967. $150 million in 1966 dollars was the total loss in Detroit. They said that in American history, only the riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. were bigger than this riot in Detroit. Only the riots that occurred after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. were bigger than this one in Detroit. The media compared Detroit to post-war Berlin in 1945. That was the headlines of the paper. Pictures. And they compared what Detroit looked like after these days of rioting, comparable to what Berlin looked like after World War II was over. And of course the Soviet newspaper, the main Soviet newspaper, gleefully printed pictures of U.S. Army tanks in the streets of Detroit. Absolutely thought it was the greatest thing ever. Who received tremendous pressure because of both the riots in Watts and Detroit? President Johnson, tremendous pressure. And finally, he did three things, took three significant actions concerning the issues of riots after the Detroit riots. He took some actions after the Detroit riots because of all the pressure he was getting from those two riots in both Watts and Los Angeles and in Detroit. First thing he did is he put together a special committee to investigate why we were having so many riots across the country. He put together a committee to study why we're having such a wave of riots across the United States. Politically, he appointed Thurgood Marshall to the United States Supreme Court, the first black man ever to serve on the nation's highest court. I'm sure you've all heard of Thurgood Marshall. We talked about him before. So he did a little political jostling by appointing Thurgood Marshall to the United States Supreme Court. But when you think about these riots, what is the problem? What is the problem?
Civil rights.
Well, yeah, but what has the government not done very well concerning these two riots we've talked about? If you don't want to get the flu, what do? You get a flu shot. You prepare. You try to do some preventative action. Well, that was the third thing he did. He finally decided to order Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to properly train all National Guard units to prepare them for future rioting. They had no riot preparation or training. So they were going into this thing at a disadvantage from the start. So to try to prevent the flu, President Johnson gives the National Guard a flu shot. In other words, he trains them. He orders Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to start preparing training for National Guard troops of what to do if there is a riot. It's just an absolute nightmare. Okay, number 6, you don't have to write anything down. I'm just going to read it to you, but I want you to pull out that photograph that I gave you in the handouts, and I want you to kind of pay attention to that photograph while I read the number 6, which is called Welcome to Mississippi 1967.